So 4 years have gone by since 2019 when we saw John Wick fall off the top of the Continental. And ever since, it's just been delay after delay, sometimes involving the pandemic, leaving fans just very anxious to see the next chapter in this series. And we've finally got it. And the big question for fans at this point is, does this film live up to the hype? And I'm here to tell you that John Wick Chapter 4 is. So we have finally made it to John Wick Chapter 4, the final piece of my John Wick review series. You can check out my other reviews. I'll put a tag for the playlist up here. But in this film, John Wick has finally figured out a way to finally, free himself from the high table. But he must tread a path of new enemies and old friends if he has any hope of surviving the massive challenge ahead of him. I really had to keep my expectations in check when it came to John Wick Chapter 4 because going into it, even before I finished watching the other three films, I was already hearing a lot of glowing reactions from people calling it an action masterpiece, best action film of all time. And I had to keep my expectations in check because I watched those other three films and I really enjoyed them, but I just didn't love either one of them. And as I was walking into the theater, I was telling myself, okay, at least let's have this film be as good as those. And keep in mind, I had already seen Scream 6 by this point, which I have reviewed recently on the channel. You can check out that review if you're interested. I loved that movie. But it was higher, certainly, than John Wick Chapter 4 was on my anticipated list. And to my pleasant surprise, I walked out of that theater, and when I was driving home, I thought to myself, I might have enjoyed that more than Scream 6. Color me shocked to say that it took me until the fourth film in a franchise to find the first one that I love. This movie is incredible. And one of the things that this movie does really well is that it actually has a better story than the previous three films. Where if you've seen my other reviews, I've talked about the issues with storytelling, the structural plot problems that I was seeing. There were moments where it felt like filler, moments that really didn't push the plot forward. But this movie, it really has this great forward momentum to it. This is pretty much all of the payoff of whatever those films were setting up. And I also talked about this at another point where I was worried about the length of this movie. 2 hours and 50 minutes. That is such a beefy runtime for a John Wick film, but it is able to use that length very well because it finds that Goldilocks zone of momentum where it's not moving too fast, but it doesn't feel like it's just dragging its feet getting where it wants to go. It feels just right. There honestly wasn't a moment in this film that dragged for me. No moment where I felt bored. This movie has possibly the best use of characters inside this franchise. No mystery here, this franchise is not the most emotional franchise out there. It's not one of the franchises that really hits home when it comes to character development and that stuff. There is some of it, but it's not the main purpose of this franchise. But this film still manages to keep certain subtleties with the character of Wick, certain subtle emotions. And there's a lot of important questions that this film asks, that it is touching on important ideas of how would this killing machine, how would this person just with a constant rage inside of him, how would he find peace? Is there really a way for John Wick to stop being John Wick? It's compelling stuff. But adding on to that, you also get attached to some of the other characters as well. You've seen a lot of Winston, you've seen quite a bit of Lawrence Fishburne's Bowery King, and they're these characters that you've grown to like over time, and there's still a chemistry to how these characters interact with each other, which whenever these characters are together, this film can get very fun. But besides capitalizing on these characters that we know, this film also incorporates some new characters as well, especially this new assassin, Kane. And he's an interesting character because he's actually blind. And it adds to these fight sequences that he has with people that are very unique. But putting the action aside, he has this intriguing dynamic with Wick, where through the script writing, through the performances of both actors, you get this subtle edge of the friendship between these two characters, and it gets to a point in the film where they have to team up. The movie gets, dare I say, inspiring. Like, it actually touches on some heartfelt stuff with these characters, which I didn't really expect out of this film. But then you also have to talk about the villain of this movie, played by Bill Skarsgård, which was something I was curious about going into this movie. So far with the John Wick movies, I've had a rough patch with the villains. The guy in the first film is okay, but then chapter 2, I found that guy less interesting, and then the adjudicator from chapter 3 is my least favorite. Could we actually get like a really good villain out of this franchise? And we do. Bill Skarsgård plays my favorite villain of the John Wick franchise. He's not a guy that you're supposed to be invested in. He's not a guy that you're supposed to see his side of the story, but he plays his angle very well. He has this certain swagger about him where he's very well dressed, very formal, and he's the type of villain you could have, say, a tea with. But he's also the type of character that if you're having that tea and the conversation isn't going so well, he could rip off your face. And Bill Skarsgård brings a lot of villainous charm while also being a character that's set up early on to be dangerous and brutal. He has a way of talking to other characters, getting inside of them, and some of the best villains are made that way, that they know how to get under people's skin. They know exactly what buttons to push with our hero, and this guy knows exactly what to say to John Wick. Which that brings me to the script writing, which the scripts for the other 3 films are pretty good as well, but here it's more noticeable. More noticeably well written, I would say, where it actually boosts the action. It actually gives a bit more substance to the action, because more so than the other films, this film, it kind of builds to an action sequence. A lot of times it's just dialogue between characters and there's this tension that's set up. And it just keeps building and building and building and just going up into this scenario where you know that something is going to happen, which the action, man, when I was heading into this film, I was hearing people saying that this was on the level of Terminator 2 Judgment Day with the action. And I was looking at that, I'm like, okay, so the action is really good, but come on, is it really that good? I mean, T2 is amazing, but is it really... Oh, okay. I see it now. Yep. Yeah, and it kind of is. It is. Yep. It is an acid trip in the best possible way. And one of the things I found interesting is that in a way it remakes a few of my favorite action set pieces from the first 2 John Wick films. But it does it in an interesting fashion, because it takes, say, the club sequence from the first John Wick, and then it has a sequence that's basically saying, okay, let's take that already amazing sequence, but what if it was nuts? And then it takes the whole plot thread about John Wick in this city full of killers, and it takes that sequence and says, okay, but what if that was nuts? It just takes these set pieces that were already great from those films, and it just makes them massive. There's a scene, I couldn't believe that I was able to keep quiet during this moment, because I was just so pumped about it. I was so excited. I couldn't believe what I was watching. A lot of the action sequences in this film, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. But there was one especially where it was filmed with a drone. And it was one take, and it was following John Wick as he was coming upstairs and then going around this house, and the drone was filming from the top of the house, showing him going from room to room, and this action sequence happening. I remember I was sitting in my seat, and I just kind of had to, I had to restrain myself, because I was like, I couldn't believe what I was watching. It was so good. I've said before, for me, action is what horror is to some people. Just watching certain sequences in this film, it was a dream come true. There's just some gorgeous cinematography, and I'm just a sucker for cinematography and wide shots, and I'm just so glad for this director that he was able to follow this story through and make what seems to be his dream film, because this film is just so massive, so epic. It's basically the same as what I thought about Matt Reeves in the Batman. That it just feels like something that he had a burning passion to make. It's finally here, and like I said, this film by all means is epic. If ever there was an action movie that deserved that title, it is John Wick Chapter 4. And finally, this film has quite possibly my favorite card game sequence in a movie since Casino Royale. Another action film that I really love, one of my favorite films of all time, by the way. The card game in here isn't as extensive as that, of course, but it was how it was done, how it ties into the story. It was cool. It was really cool. Now, as far as issues, I only really have one kind of gripe with the film, that it's similar to what I said about Scream 6, that it's something that this thing could disappear with a rewatch. And it is kind of weird talking about now because I think John Wick 5 has already been confirmed. This movie felt like a good conclusion chapter. But the whole time that I was watching this film, I already had in mind that they were going to make another one. And when it seemed like it was giving definite answers, when it seemed like it was closing off John Wick's story, it kind of surprised me. I'm not going to lie. It felt a bit sudden. But the more I thought about it, the more it kind of worked for me. While still there were certain points in the beginning of the movie where I felt like certain plot points, certain elements could have been slightly fleshed out a bit more. And there's a section of film at the start where it feels like it's less about John Wick and it's more about these other characters that we're getting introduced to, which is really cool. You get sucked into the world once again and you're interested in these new characters, but it felt weird for me because Wick wasn't the center of focus. This film makes up for it later on in the back half, and you get a lot of Wick, and of course, there's a form of crescendo in this movie, and it ends well. But just in the end, having seen all three of the other films, I didn't expect to like this film as much as I did. Even before I watched the series, I didn't expect to like this film as much as I did. It surpassed my expectations on both of those levels. And I haven't seen too many movies this year because I've been busy with college, like I've mentioned a few other times. But of the movies that I've seen, this is actually my favorite film of 2023 so far. And it could be one of my favorites of the decade. It's certainly one of my favorite action films of the 2020s. I'm going to give John Wick Chapter 4 an A. So stay tuned for my Scream 6 spoiler review. I promise it's going to come. It's taken me a while, but now that I've gotten a few more of these reviews out there, I think I can finally get more solidified with that one. And also, I feel like I'm going to review the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy. I've kind of not been working on my MCU review series, and an unfortunate thing happened at the beginning of this year where I kind of lost all the files that I've been working on. And instead of just going back and re-recording some of these, I'm just going to be reviewing films as they kind of appear. So like if we get another Thor film, I'll review the other Thor films, for example. But now that we have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, I'll review all three of those films sometime very shortly. If you're interested in any of those, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, give me some support, and I'll see you guys next time.